Today, I'm going to keep going through Matthew's Gospel like I have been, and we've made it into what I have called Section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, and that is roughly from the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the very end of chapter 25. And that whole section of Matthew is about the events of Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, because most of what he does here is very confrontational, very much calls them out for their response to him and their just continuing stubbornness against truth. So that has a very judgmental tone here at the very end of things. So that's where we are. Now, in that, there's a kind of special portion even within that is kind of needs its own treatment, and that's the Olivet Discourse, which is a private sermon from Jesus to his disciples, which he taught them on the Mount of Olives just outside of Jerusalem. And that's Matthew 24 and 25. And we've been there for quite some time. In this portion, Jesus is predicting and describing the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. And we've really gone into as much detail as seemed necessary with trying to understand these things. And we've made it to the very last half of all this, where Matthew starts recording parables from Jesus, exhorting us to watch for his return. So we are very much within the application section of Jesus' sermon, as you want to think of it that way. So kind of a different tone here in the last part of the Olivet Discourse overall. Well, today I'm going to discuss the second of these parables that he's given us, and that is the parable of the two slaves. So let's read Matthew 24, verses 45 through 51. So right there at the end of chapter 24. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So my sermon today is called The Blessings of Slavery, two words that probably do not often get joined together, blessings of slavery. And in this parable we learn that Jesus, upon his return, will bless faithfulness and prudence with greater opportunities for service. So that is my summary of what this parable is trying to convey to us as we think about the return of Christ and what we need to be doing, what kind of people we need to be as we make ready for his return. My outline has three headings, and all of these are exhortations for us as we await the return of Christ. So much like Jesus is in his application section, these sermons are very much more applicational. They're meant to prod you in a certain direction. So my three headings today are these. Prepare for the Lord's return by acting like a slave. Prepare for the Lord's return by faithfully serving other Christians. And prepare for the Lord's return by thinking ahead to future blessing. So acting like a slave, faithfully serving other Christians, and thinking ahead to future blessing. Those are the headings for today. Now, I've been throwing around this word slave quite a bit here in the very beginning of the sermon. So it stands to reason, and we might need to talk about that a little bit more. And specifically, I want to just connect this a little bit more to your life. And for some reason, as I was thinking about doing that, I began targeting the children here. So I have sort of a question here for you kids as you think about these things and try to learn these concepts from the Bible. I would just like to ask you kids, how many of you would like to be a slave? Any of you? Anyone eager to sell themselves into slavery somewhere? No volunteers? None. Okay. I didn't think so. Here's another question for you. do you think your life is much different from the life of a slave? Anyone? I thought you think, some people saying, yeah, this is pretty different, pretty different. Okay, well, fair enough, but I want to read you something that Paul wrote in one of his letters, just to maybe reposition your thoughts on this a little bit. So Paul makes this very brief statement in Galatians 4, verse 1. I just want to read this briefly. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything, but he's under guardians and managers until the day set by the Father. Okay, so according to Paul, you young people, of course, you young people are all in some sense children, and you stand eventually to inherit much of what your parents own. My dad always tells me when I'm talking about stuff he owns, he's like, well, someday it'll all be yours. So it's just like, okay, great. Someday you get that stuff from your parents very often, so you're the heir, right? You're the heir of what your parents own. And yet, in spite of that, every day you have to obey what your parents tell you to do immediately without any buts or any complaining. You can be punished for not obeying in some way. And then you also have nothing that actually belongs to you. And even if you do have something that you think of as yours, your parents can just take that away and it's gone. I mean, they can do that. They can just take it away from you, no matter what. Now, seems to me as we think about that, and we go back to my earlier question, do you think your life is much different than that of a slave? Not that much different, is it? I mean, your whole life is obedience, possible punishment, and you don't own anything, and these people over you can do basically whatever they want. Sounds a lot like slavery. Now, the thing about that is, even as we think about that and put those ideas into your head, I've never really heard any of you complain, really, about the situation. And as I asked you earlier, do any of you think your life is like that of a slave? None of you really thought that it was. I mean, you don't really view your life as this unbearable oppression that slaves very often have to endure. And the reason for that, I think, is very simple. It's because your parents actually love you and they are reasonable people, which makes all the difference in your situation, which is why you don't think of yourself as a slave, even if you really aren't that much different in the day-to-day from a slave's life. Now, I tell you that to get you ready for our sermon today, because it's very much about slavery, but it's about slavery to Christ. Him being our owner and our master, we being his slaves. And although today's parable very much places us in the role of slaves, this is actually a blessing, and it's a chance for greater blessing. And much of that is because of the character of our master, Christ himself, who actually loves us and is more than reasonable. I think that's probably an understatement to call him that. But he makes all the difference in the tone of our lives. But nonetheless, we are his slaves, and that does have implications for how we think about the Christian life. And that's really where this parable is targeting us today as we think about this. So that's what we're talking about. I hope you young people at least can think about this and maybe see a bit more commonality now with this idea of being a slave to Christ. So let's start with the first of those exhortations I was going to give you. Prepare for the Lord's return by acting like a slave. So very much talking about how we're supposed to conduct ourselves and have the mindset of slavery. Now immediately I need to address a bit of a difference in wording used by different Bible translations, which very often happens, about this word I'm talking about. In this passage, some translations, like the NASB, which I'm using here today, uses the word slave to describe the two characters in this parable. You've got a faithful and sensible slave, and you've got an evil slave, as the NASB puts it. Meanwhile, a good number of translations use another word, servant. So maybe you're using a Bible translation today that uses that word instead of the word slave. And throughout the entire Bible, we can see different Bible translations take different approaches to these kinds of words. Some translations being very comfortable using the word slave, and others not so much and preferring to use words like servant and all of that. So this is something you'll encounter in passages throughout the Bible and as you compare Bible translations. I consider it worthwhile to dwell on this point since the main angle of this parable we're studying today really is about slavery or servitude, depending on how you're translating it. So we got to talk about this at least a little bit. Now, just the feeling of these words, slave and servant, are very different their connotation, if you want to use the technical term for what that feeling about words is. See, we can use the word servant in ways that are positive. It doesn't necessarily have a bad ring to it. We can talk about servant leadership, which we consider a very noble thing. We can call people who are kind of over our country a public servant. And usually when we say that, we're trying to honor them by saying that. Or we can talk about serving one another, as we often do among Christians, and we think nothing of it. So servant, that's a pretty positive word overall as we use it. Meanwhile, we almost never use the word slave in any kind of positive sense. That word is negative. I mean, none of you, as I was talking to your kids earlier, none of you really thought my comparison to you as slaves made any sense, right? I mean, we don't think well of that word. Whether we talk about slaving over a hot stove, making food, or literally being enslaved like people have been, the word carries with it some heavy baggage. No one likes this word, slave. So to be more technical about this, the real difference, to talk about actual denotation, your dictionary definition of these words, servants and slaves differ in that servants have more rights, they have more of a chance of escaping servitude, and perhaps might even be paid for their services, whereas slaves have fewer rights, less of a chance at freedom, and almost no way to get anything of their own. So very much lower on the ladder of society slaves are. Servants are further up here, slaves are further down here, which is where we get the negative feelings we have about this word slave. So the tone of today's parable changes remarkably based on whether we're talking about servants or slaves. The word you use there is going to affect your whole response as you just really read this parable and try to apply it to your life. Now, in reality, the issue is not difficult at all from a translation perspective. Actually, working back from the Greek that Matthew used, translating it into English, there's no question. The word is slave. It's a word that very often is used for slave in Greek. The word doulos is kind of the common word for a person who has been enslaved. He is owned by another person. Right? So it's not really difficult there. The only reason we often translate words like these as servant is because we're trying to steer around the negative connotations. We don't really like to have those bad vibes whenever we're reading the Bible. Nonetheless, as a matter of what the word actually means, slave is the word. They have other words for servant they could have used if they wanted to tone back the language a little bit. But they didn't use that word here. Matthew uses the word for slave. So there's really no question there. So that being said, the parable seeks to cast every person, whether faithful or evil, in the role of a slave to God. No matter what. You can be one kind of slave or the other, but you are a slave, one way or the other. Now, in modern times, we're perfectly hostile toward this idea of slavery, without any exceptions to that rule. That's pretty much the way things have gone. Despite this, of course, history has been full of people enslaving one another, which continues even today in various forms, whether it's even illegal slavery or not. So it's very much a part of life in this world, is looking back in history in some places today. And we look at that and, of course we view slavery as this terrible thing, so we might be tempted to ask, well, why has God done this? Why has God even brought this whole idea of slavery into the world? Why do we have people enslaving one another as we look at history or some parts of the world? Why would God do that? Why would He ordain a world in which slavery has existed? And the reason is very simple. Slavery is a fitting image for how all people must relate to God. And to get that across to us, God has actually made people as slaves in this world. He has ordained that to happen so that He can point to them and say, look, just as these slaves relate to their masters, this is how all people must relate to me. And without those slaves, He would have no word to use for that. And that's all very much true. God owns us as He owns all things. He created all things. His stamp is on all of it, including us. And everything we own is actually owned by God. We speak of having houses and property and all this stuff inside of our homes, but it's not really ours. We're all just kind of renting it from God in some respect. And God, meanwhile, requires us to work for His own purposes. And we ourselves have no say in the matter. God's plan is the only plan, and if you rebel against that, you bear the consequences. There is punishment for that. Furthermore, if we resent our slavery to God and we attempt to run away as a slave might run away from his owner, God will inevitably find us. There is no underground railroad to take us far away from God. We just can't get that far enough away from God to truly escape him. There's no getting away from the slavery, from the service that we owe to him as slaves. It has to be this way. And that is exactly how this parable tries to cast all people as slaves to God, one way or the other, whether faithful or evil. Now, harsh as all that is, Matthew goes so far as to make the situation sound perhaps a little harsher than it had to be. So I think Matthew is really kind of dialing it up here in terms of making you squirm a little bit as you really think about this parable and what it says about your relationship to God. And I say that because of the way Luke records the same parable. If you were to go over to Luke chapter 12, you would see basically the same parable, very similar. But Matthew, of course, and Luke, they have some differences between them. It's the usual display of similarity and difference that you have when you compare gospel accounts. One difference, though, is that Luke calls the slave a steward, which is another word that we don't usually use very often in our world. But a steward is a slave or a servant, perhaps, who has complete control of the master's household and business. All right? So a steward is pretty high ranking. He's over all the other slaves, over all the stuff. As far as slaves go, the steward is the man in charge. So if you're going to be a slave, it's best to be the steward, right? Because at least you have some rank. You've got some pull there. Your master trusts you enough to put you in charge of things. So you got some power and prestige. Even if you're a slave, if you're the steward, that's pretty good. You've done well for yourself. Matthew, however, he doesn't like to give us even that much comfort. He doesn't use the word steward. He doesn't go there. He robs us of that consolation. The faithful slave in his version of the parable is just a slave, not a steward. He just uses the word slave. So, Luke was willing to give us a little bit there and be like, okay, you're a steward. That's pretty good. Matthew's like, no, you're a slave. Get used to it. Deal with it. This is how the parable goes. And I'm just like, all right. So he's really got us tied in here to this role as a slave to God as we think about these things. And our pride will certainly make us kick against all of this slavery talk, and make us really reject this whole idea. I'm sure, especially among unbelievers, this is a very resentful thing, to them that we would be slaves to God. But we have an old saying for these kinds of occasions. I love my old sayings. And this one is simply this: if you can't beat them, join them, right? We have those sayings for a reason, and this saying in particular. And that's the basic mentality we have to have as we relate to God as a slave. You can't get out of this. You can't beat God at this game. So that being the case, it's time to just fall in line and go with it and see where it takes you. Now, one of the great differences between the faithful slave in the parable and the wicked slave is that the faithful slave acts like a slave. He does as he was told. We actually see that here in his introduction here. Basically, the idea is he is put in charge of the food, as Matthew puts it here, and he does that. He's faithful, and he gets rewarded when that happens. And amazingly, that faithful slave eventually gets what Matthew denied him at the very beginning. He basically does become a steward. Matthew doesn't use the word, but we see in verse 47, "Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions." That's the job description of a steward. So he didn't start out as one, but he was faithful, and now he gets the stewardship. It actually turns out well for this guy, the faithful slave. On the other hand, the evil slave is cut in pieces and thrown into the outer darkness, and doesn't turn out so well for him. He tried to be his own boss, and he failed at that. He tried to get away from this whole slavery business, and that didn't work. It didn't work at all for him. And being mere creatures, we will never excel the Creator, nor ever be his equal. It's not going to happen that way. That might happen in history with literal slaves, but when it comes to being a slave to God in Christ, that just doesn't happen. But that does not mean we have no way to improve our situation. Just like in the real world of slavery, you can make something of that. If you just keep your head down and work and do as you're told, you can actually get somewhere. and so it is in the kingdom of God. And we should be all the more willing to go along with our place in God's creation, since our master happens to be the best master. It's not like we're serving someone who's just ultra oppressive and out to get us. God is very different from how the masters of literal slaves might be here in the world. As I explained before to the younger people, they often don't complain about their very slave-like existence simply because they have parents who do love them and act decently. They have reasonable masters for the most part. This is why none of you thought, when I was asking you these questions, none of you thought of yourselves as slaves, because your life doesn't seem that bad because your parents love you and they do well with you. Well, God is much better than all of that, much better than your parents. And He's able to give much more in return for years of faithful service. You might very well inherit all that your parents own someday, but God can give you much more than even that. And He's promised us that too. When Jesus returns, a good number of slaves will find themselves promoted to the rank of steward. They will get the reward for their many years of faithful servitude, under Him as slaves. And since the whole earth, of course, will belong to Christ in those days, they will have great control over many possessions. This isn't a small-time stewardship we're talking about. This is a stewardship over the entire earth. Just as Christ Himself will be king of the earth, we faithful slaves will be stewards of that whole creation. And that's the first lesson to learn from this parable of the two slaves. Prepare for the Lord's return by acting like a slave. Just own the role, go with it. It leads to a good place. And it is not nearly as bad as that word slave would trick you into thinking it is. So act like a slave, and you get these kinds of blessings that Jesus talks about in this parable. Now, the second lesson from this parable is that you should prepare for the Lord's return by faithfully serving other Christians. Now, you may not see this so evidently in the parable, but I do think it is there, so we'll talk about it here. As we often think of this model slave as faithful, right? I mean, that's the thing Jesus leads out with in describing this guy. He calls him faithful. But we never seem to dwell on how the slave is faithful. What is he actually doing that is faithful? So let's read verse 45 again. See how Jesus describes this. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Okay, so that's the job description as the slave master is away, and he leaves this slave in charge of things. What's he in charge of? Food, like giving food to the household. Okay, that's his job. So that's where we're going with this. That's one job that he has. Now remember, in the ancient world, as you think about this, as you try to think about the parable playing out as a parable, as a story, remember that the household isn't just your children, your spouse, and all that kind of things. Your household also includes your servants and your slaves. So not kind of foreign to our use of the word household, because we don't have slaves, and we usually don't have servants either. I know I don't. But in the ancient world, your household was your family, yes, but also your servants and your slaves. So the household was decently big in the ancient world. And since we're dealing with a kind of allegory, I suppose that this faithful slave necessarily, of course, represents a Christian, a faithful Christian, but also those other members of the household, they have to represent something as well. And I presume that they represent other Christians, other people in this household owned by this, or either owned by this master or related to him. But nonetheless, other people in the household must be other people, and specifically other Christians, at least other professing Christians, people who would put themselves in this role as a slave to Christ. So here is the great task assigned to us when you think about this, as we wait for the Lord's return. The great task is to care for other Christians, the rest of your master's household, which as I think about it, I'm looking at the rest of my master's household right now. And other Christians that I meet, them too. Like whoever else is allegedly part of Jesus' household, I'm supposed to be, giving them their food in due season, to use the language of the parable. All right? So that is the task. And the great question we have to ask ourselves as slaves of Jesus is whether we are caring for other Christians. Are we doing this? Are we giving, food in due season to these other members of my master's household here? And in this is how Jesus will judge us as either faithful or not. This is the faithfulness that we have in mind here as we think about this particular parable. Now, such a parable as this is especially fitting for the 12 apostles who are sitting there listening to Jesus as he tells these parables, because they will soon be overseers for the newly formed church, not too long from now. They're going to be, the people that are very much in charge of getting this whole Christianity thing going. So they especially have to worry about, being faithful to the charge given them and caring for the people of God. But really, all Christians have this responsibility to some degree, to love one another, to encourage one another, to provoke one another to love and good deeds, and generally just to look out for one another and treat each other in those ways. So be sure, as you think about these things, be sure that you are that kind of faithful slave as you wait for the return of Christ. Be sure that you are caring for your master's household, those around you. Now, the good news is Christ has set the bar very low in this regard. This is, in many respects, easy. It is easy to be faithful in this way. In the language of the parable, the slave is praised for being faithful, and being faithful is simply a matter as doing what you're told. He gave him this task. All he has to do is follow instructions. That's it. In other words, faithfulness requires nothing special out of you. No creativity, no intelligence, no charisma. None of that is actually necessary to being a faithful slave. The master has laid it all out for you. All you got to do is do as you were told. You don't need any special abilities. Further, using the language of the parable, the task of handing out food is equally simple. Presumably, all the food is there. It's just a matter of doling it out. He doesn't tell the slave to go find food. It's nothing like that. Just like hand it out. Just give it out to people in due season. That's all you got to do. Here's the schedule, follow the schedule, done. Simple. And yet this remarkably simple task is also such an essential task that you are bound to receive thanks from your fellow slaves. Thinking about this, from the language of the parable and the analogy given to us by Jesus, those other slaves would have a terrible time if they had no food. If it's all locked up in this pantry thing over here and you've got the key and you never open it up, they're going to have a really hard time while the master's gone. But if you open that thing up and start handing out food, that's great. And you know what? They're going to like you because you're the one giving them their food. You're going to be very popular in that household if you're the one handing out all the food. Now, breaking away from the language of the parable, in the actual Christian life, we should remember all of that in our conduct toward one another. We should be applying those same basic ideas. You might view the task of caring for each other as especially difficult, and maybe something that's beyond your ability. But I assure you, you are overcomplicating it. It is not as hard as you're making it out to be. If your love for people is real, if it is genuine, it will be easily shown by the smallest of words or actions. You don't have to try to sit there and think of some really good way to do it. You can if you want to, but even that's not necessary. All you have to do is show them the love that you actually have for them, and it will be appreciated. The smallest of words, the smallest of actions is sometimes all that is needed in the life of a Christian, especially when going through a hard time. Some kind of mercy, some kind of compassion, anything, even in the smallest amount, it's enough. If you can muster the faithfulness to just obey that basic idea and follow through with that, God will manage the results. He's the one that handles the big picture stuff. Your job is to follow the schedule, obey, do as you're told. God handles the rest, both for you and for others. You don't have to make it any more complicated than any of that. Just give out the food in due season. That's all you have to do. Now, regrettably, not every slave will be so faithful, which brings us to the wicked hypocrisy of the other slave. To read again the last half of the parable, starting in verse 48. But if that evil slave says in his heart, "My master is not coming for a long time," and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, the amazing thing about this other slave, the evil one, is that he spent more energy being wicked than he would have spent on being faithful. Like, he made his job harder and got nothing out of it. In fact, he lost everything, including his life. I have already mentioned how simple it is to be faithful at the task of handing out food. Again, just following the language of the parable, the job given was not hard. This would have been easy to do. Do you know how difficult, on the other hand, do you know how difficult it is to beat somebody? You know, how much energy you have to expend to actually beat somebody. And not just one person, multiple people. You're going to go around beating up multiple people. That takes a lot of work. And it's not always kind on the knuckles as you're doing it either, or whatever you're using, right? Just all of that, making it so much harder on yourself doing all this stuff. And then, can you imagine the pains of throwing a feast for a bunch of drunkards? They're not exactly polite company. They're not exactly tame. They tend to like mess stuff up and break things. And here this guy is, he's like eating and drinking with all these gluttons and drunkards. Like, that's not a good time. I guess they would consider it so, but when you stand back and look at it objectively, he's making it harder on himself all the way down. The wicked slave would have had an easier time of things if he had just been faithful. You know, dude, just hand out the food. Just do what you're told. Instead, he's going to go around beating people up, throwing parties for worthless people, and just absolutely making everything more difficult on himself. And then, after expending all that energy and putting all that effort into things, all he gets for his labor is to be cut in pieces, as the parable says. So there's not even a payoff. There's not even a reward to any of this. Now, the silliness of this wickedness and the brutality of its punishment, serve as pictures for us of the alternative to caring faithfully for our fellow Christians. This is the other side of the road, and there's only two options here. And I want to point that out to you and just let that sink into you. There are only two kinds of slaves in this parable. There's the faithful one, and there's the evil one. There's no third kind of slave. You can be one or the other. So don't think that you can be a truly neutral party in the church to where you're not really helping anybody, but you're not really harming anybody either, so you're kind of in the middle. There is no middle in this parable. There is no third kind of slave that just doesn't do anything at all. That's not how this works. You are either helping people onward in the faith, or you might as well just beat them, steal their food, and just hang out with a bunch of drunkards all the time. You might as well just go all the way in one direction or the other. And the point I'm trying to make here is this. Christians, all Christians, every single one of us, we need so much help going along in the Christian life that if you're not helping, you are holding people back. We have the expression dead weight, people not pulling their own weight. Like, that is a harmful thing. That actually does slow down everyone else around you. And that's the kind of thing you need to see in this parable. You can be one or the other. You can be faithful or you can be evil. You are either helping or you are hurting. There is no in between. And you have to think about things in that way. And you got to choose which side of that division you're going to be on. You're going to be the faithful slave, you're going to be the evil slave. Those are your options. There's no neutral ground in all of this. Now, the only other thing to say about all this, as we talk about this wicked slave in particular here, is that Matthew is somewhat unique and surprising in that he says the wicked slave is assigned a place with the hypocrites, using that word. Very unusual to find it pop up here in this parable. See, Luke doesn't do that. I mentioned Luke's version of the parable in Luke chapter 12. He doesn't say hypocrites, he says unbelievers. But Matthew says hypocrites, which is kind of an interesting word choice. The word hypocrite brings to mind the scribes and the Pharisees, who are the people Jesus normally calls hypocrites throughout the gospel, especially here in Matthew. I mean, it wasn't that long ago we saw Matthew 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. I mean, they're kind of the consummate hypocrites in the ministry of Jesus. Now, these men, the scribes and the Pharisees, they seem to be the most holy and knowledgeable Jews among the Jews there. They seem that way. But all they did was weigh the Jews down with burdens, burdens which they themselves would not lift with even their little finger. And that's the kind of thing you need to see in this parable. You can be one or the other. You can be faithful slave, you can be the evil slave. Those are your options. There's no neutral ground in all of this. Now, the only other thing to say about all this, as we talk about this wicked slave in particular here, is that Matthew is somewhat unique and surprising in that he says the wicked slave is assigned a place with the hypocrites, using that word. Very unusual to find it pop up here in this parable. because Jesus says that about them too in Matthew 23. He says they weigh down people with burdens and they don't even lift them with their little finger. Not at all. So there they are weighing people down. And according to this parable, this evil slave deserves to be in the company of such hypocrites. He is one of them. He is like the scribes and the Pharisees in that regard. And why is that? Because he counts himself as a slave of his master, but at the same time, he's starving his fellow slaves and hurting them, which also hurts the master. He has a name of being the servant, being the slave of this particular master, but really he's working against everything his master is trying to do, everything his master wants done. And for that reason, he is a hypocrite. He wants the name, but he doesn't have the reality. He wants the name of a slave, but not the reality of it. It's just like the scribes and the Pharisees. So yeah, this kind of thing is very hypocritical. And that's the other side of the line from being a faithful slave. So instead of merely calling yourself a slave of Christ and acting otherwise, you should prepare for the Lord's return by faithfully serving other Christians. Actually make the effort to help and care for the people of God, and don't even get close to being on that other side of the line of the evil slave and the hypocrite. That's the other half of this parable. All right, well, finally, last major heading for today. We learn from this parable that we should prepare for the Lord's return by thinking ahead to future blessing. And here I'm going to read verses 45 through 47 again. And as I read this, again, consider thinking ahead to future blessing. So who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. Now in this final part of my sermon, I need to address the other word that is used to describe this faithful slave, because there are two words Jesus uses to describe this guy. One of them is faithful, and the other one depends on your Bible translation. So again, we have one of these interesting translation issues. Now the NASB that I'm using uses the word sensible. Okay? A good number of Bible translations will use another word. They very often use the word wise. Okay? I am not so fond of using the word wise here to translate this particular word because the word wise is kind of broad. There are a lot of different ways for a person to be wise. I feel like it's too general. Maybe we need to narrow the field a little bit, get a more particular word in here. Now, the word sensible that the NASB uses, I'm also somewhat critical of that just because of the way we use this word. We tend to use the word sensible of people who agree with us, and which kind of makes it a bit of a selfish word. It's like, well, he's a sensible person. That means he agrees with everything I said. It's not a very good word in terms of what we're really trying to do here in this particular parable. So I'm not so fond of the word sensible either. Now, to drive down to the very source, the Greek word employed here by Matthew, phronimos, and all of its related words, they all simply refer to careful thought, so deep thinking, right? That's what the word group basically means, okay? So based on that, you might suggest the translation thoughtful. The problem with that is we typically use the word thoughtful for someone who is kind, which is not exactly what's going on here, right? So we've got all these words we could use. None of them are really landing on what Jesus is trying to say about this slave. So we've got a real problem here figuring out a word that we can use for this word. So what do we do? Well, interesting. The NASB actually does have a very good translation of this same word in the very next parable. I don't know why they don't use it up here in chapter 24, but in chapter 25, when you get to the parable of the 10 virgins, it calls them prudent. And if you want to see this, if you're using the NASB, that's Matthew 25, verse 2, for those of you that are using the NASB. And that's the same word. That's the same exact word used here of this faithful slave. So they've got a word there that they can use, prudent, and I think that's a perfect word to talk about what we're describing here today. Now, the problem is we don't usually use the word prudent anymore, so it's kind of an old-fashioned word, but I think it's a very good word because it refers to something very specific that I think is exactly what is going on here in the parable of the two slaves. Prudence is the kind of wisdom that thinks before it acts. It's the kind of wisdom that you use before you actually do something. You're going to sit there and think about the consequences for a little bit, and then you're going to act. You're going to make your decision based on careful thought. Prudence is the kind of wisdom that's concerned with future consequences. And I think that is exactly what is going on in the parable of the two slaves and with this Greek word that is so difficult to translate. So this faithful slave is prudent, to use the wording that I have chosen for this. So prudent. And since that faithful slave is prudent, we too then, as we think about the return of Christ and how we're supposed to be as we're waiting for his return, one of our key words ought to be prudence. We should become the kind of people who think ahead and think carefully about our actions before we do things. And that's how we're going to be ready for the return of Christ. Now, in this parable, the faithful slave is prudent in a way that is, again, very simple. All it is, again, this isn't anything complicated. He simply realizes that someday his master will return, right? I mean, that's it. That's the extent of this particular slave's prudence. It's not anything more than that. I said earlier that being faithful required nothing special. Well, likewise, being prudent doesn't always require something special. If a master, the slave owner, if he leaves home and tells the slave that he will return at some point, it is absolutely understandable to think that the master will return. Like, this is not anything great. This is not rocket science. This is, dare I say, common sense to think this way. And yet, this very simple observation guided that slave into the right way. He acted faithfully so that his master would be pleased upon his return. He just acted like his master was coming back, which was exactly what was going to happen anyway. That's it. Prudence isn't anything special in itself. It's just taking the time to think about things before you act and then acting according to what your mind tells you. Meanwhile, the evil slave, instead of living in the future, lived in the moment. He totally cut himself off from any future consequences and just focused on the here and now. Disregarding all common sense, the evil slave acted as though the future would never become the present, and he bore the terrible consequences of that. As we can read again, just to read the last half of the parable again, starting in verse 48. But if that evil slave says in his heart, "My master is not coming for a long time," and begins to beat his fellow servants and eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, the parables of Jesus often involve some kind of shocking surprise. I've mentioned this before in talking about other parables. It's one of the genius aspects of Jesus' parables that he always throws something in there that no one would have expected. Well, in this case, the shocking surprise is that the evil slave is cut in pieces for his disobedience. You would never have seen that coming in an ordinary household back then in that time and place. That is not a common punishment. And to be a little more extreme here, cutting in pieces, the more literal translation would be cut in half. So exactly 2 pieces, for those of you wondering about the details of these kinds of things. But that's what he gets for his disobedience. Now, if that seems too severe for his wrongdoing, it is too severe for his wrongdoing. Normally a slave would not be punished that way. But of course, this punishment represents hell, right? This is where the actual meaning of the parable is bleeding into the parable somewhat. This actually represents the eternal consequences of acting as though Jesus was never coming back, acting as though the master would never return. He makes that very plain here in the way he describes it, the weeping and the gnashing of teeth. It's a very common description of hell in the teaching of Jesus. So all that being the case, it would be a lot better to be prudent and to be on that side of things rather than the other side. to consider the end from the beginning, as the faithful slave did, to think ahead to what's happening in the future and act accordingly here and now. Now, as for us, we have an advantage over this faithful, prudent slave in the parable, in that we have been told what awaits us for being faithful and prudent. We have more of an idea in the Christian life than this faithful slave does in the parable. I have mentioned this already, but verse 47, "Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions." The reward is that he's made steward of his master's house. Now in the parable then, this prudent slave gets promoted from being just over the food to being over everything. He gets made a steward. Now we have no way of knowing if the prudent slave had in mind a chance to be promoted. We don't know what he was thinking. Jesus doesn't tell us what he was thinking. We're not told that. At best, he probably hoped maybe someday to get a promotion. Most workers do. Most people are trying to get up the chain of their job wherever they are, and I'm sure slaves are no different in that regard. But at most, he hoped for it. There was no indication that the master told this guy, "Hey, if you do well at this, I'll make you steward of my whole house." We don't see that in the parable. We have no way of knowing and no reason to think that this faithful slave knew that was going to happen. But we have been told directly through this parable that Christ will promote us in his kingdom if we are faithful and prudent. We know because of this parable that it's not always going to be like this. It is actually going to be better if we are faithful and prudent now. We actually know that through this parable. We actually will inherit all things alongside Christ. When the king comes and conquers everything, we're going to be the stewards. He's going to give that to us. We will inherit those things, which gives us yet another reason to have a sense of prudence about us as we go about the Christian life. We know not only that our master is coming, but that he brings a blessing with him if we only think ahead and act accordingly. As long as we're able to live in those days coming in the future, when Jesus brings his reward with him, as long as we're willing to and able to live in those days now and act accordingly, we will have that blessing. Now, you might argue, and I'm sure some of you do, you might argue that you have no interest in being rewarded for your faithfulness and prudence. You think all this talk of a reward is just beneath you and beneath the Christian life, right? You should be serving God because it's right, not because of any kind of reward. Well, apparently, Jesus believes you should be interested because he has told us about this. If we really were supposed to just be doing it because it's right, Jesus wouldn't have mentioned any of this talk about reward or blessing coming for anything. But he talks about it a lot. I've pointed this out every time it shows up in Matthew. Jesus really wants you thinking this way, right? This idea of reward and blessing should be on our minds, and it should be a factor in our prudence as we go about the Christian life. And Christ is correct that we ought to be interested in that blessing, because that blessing is actually a greater chance to serve him. Because all of you, you're saying like, I don't care about the reward. Well, do you care about serving Christ? Well, yes, I care about serving Christ. Well, would you like a greater opportunity to serve Christ? Yes, I would like a greater opportunity to serve Christ. Well, guess what? That's the reward, because that's what a steward does. He serves his master more than all the other slaves. This guy's over here doing his thing, this slave's over here doing his thing, but the steward's over everything. He is bending everything in that house to work toward the end of pleasing his master. He can do more. He can do so much more at the top. In the same way that being a steward is better than being a table waiter, we have that in the kingdom of God. Our service now is going to be dwarfed by the kind of service we can provide to Christ later when he returns. And when the kingdom is fully inaugurated and everything is set for eternity, we're going to be doing so much more than we are now. If we're faithful and if we're prudent, we'll get there. And we'll have so much more opportunities to serve him, things that we can't even fathom right now. It's coming as long as you're faithful and as long as you're prudent. And that should be something that concerns you. That should be a reward that you are interested in getting. So, as always, do it for the reward, because that reward is actually more service to Christ, which is exactly what you want. That's why you're a Christian, right? Okay, so I began this sermon mentioning the blessings of slavery, plural. More than one, the blessings of slavery. Now I've mentioned one blessing in particular, the reward we will have for our faithfulness and prudence when Jesus returns. Just got done talking about that. But the other blessing I have in mind is something I've not mentioned until now. That slaves actually get to share in the work of their master. Being a slave to your master is not all bad because you get to join in the stuff that he's trying to do. Now, of course, if your master is foolish or wicked, that's no blessing. You don't want to be a slave of that kind of person. But if your master is God himself, then you share in the work of God when you submit to be his slave. If you're willing to be a slave of God, you join him in the work of God, which surely must be glorious. Surely that's a great thing. And on that note, I'd like to read, just as one of my closing thoughts here, a brief part of Psalm 104. You don't necessarily have to go there, but I will read this to you from Psalm 104. And I'm going to read verses 24 through 27. And there's really just one phrase I want to highlight in here, but I want you to have the context, so we'll read a few more verses. Psalm 104, verse 24 through verse 27. O Lord, how many are your works? In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. There is the sea, great and broad, in which are swarms without number, animals both great and small. There the ships move along, and Leviathan, which you have formed to sport in it. They all wait for you to give them their food in due season. Now, verse 27, again, they all wait for you to give them their food in due season. So part of this description of the greatness of God's works and the things he does, part of that is him giving food to all the animals, right? And that's part of God's work in this world, according to this psalm. Now, if that sounds familiar, giving them food in due season, it's because Jesus used that same phrase in today's parable for the slave's job while the master was absent. He was supposed to be giving food to the household in due season. It is practically the same exact phrase as we see here in Psalm 04. So you might say this: in the same way that God cares for animals, Christ has appointed us to care for each other, right? So we are very much joining in the work of God as he is, doing things for his whole creation. He's segmented off a part of that and said, okay, you guys, here's your job. You do what I'm doing here. In the same way that I'm giving food to the whole world, you take care of one another. That's the job. And that is how we are joining God in his work. And that in itself is a blessing, to actually join in alongside God in the things he is doing in this great world he has made. So that is the other blessing I had in mind with all of that. Those are the blessings of slavery. And I've tried to exhort you along those lines today. Again, just to kind of recite the major headings for today so you have them all in your mind here at the end. I said we should prepare for the Lord's return by acting like slaves, prepare for the Lord's return by faithfully serving other Christians, and prepare for the Lord's return by thinking ahead to future blessing. There's the prudence that I was talking about. If we do those things, Jesus will bless faithfulness and prudence with greater opportunities for service upon his return. We can look forward to that, as we go about our lives as his slaves. So that is the purpose then, that is my point today from this last parable in Matthew 24. Next time, whenever I teach next, it'll be about a month from now. Chad has the next several messages. But when I do teach next, I'll be teaching in Matthew 25, the parable of the 10 virgins. So continuing much the same as we've been doing in these parables. So that's all for today. Are there questions or comments that anyone has about today's parable or anything I said?